The rope went taut across her shoulder, and the dead wagon answered with a groan that carried half a mile down the dry wash. Lurleen leaned into the harness beside her mule and felt every joint of the ruined thing fight her, axle dragging a furrow in the calash. One wheel locked solid with grit. The bed canted like a sinking boat. Behind her, where the road from the freight depot bent toward the settlement, a handful of men had come out to watch a woman haul home 400 pounds of splintered freight wagon that any sensible person would have left to the buzzards in the sun. They were not quiet about it. She did not turn around. She set her boots. She counted the pull under her breath the way her father had taught her, and she moved the wreck another length toward home. It would be 11 days before the seat came loose, and when it did, the men who laughed that afternoon would have nothing to say at all. This is a story about a thing the world threw away, and what it had been hiding in plain sight for 9 years. If you have ever been measured by people who never once looked closely at you, stay near, because the looking is the whole of it. She was 31 years old that spring, and she had been alone for 2 of those years, since the fever took her father in the back room of the wheelwright shop he had built with his own hands. His name had been on the shingle, and after him there was only her, and a settlement that did not believe a woman could true a wheel or set a tire, or read the grain of an axle the way a man could. The territory of New Mexico in the year 1879 had little patience for a wheelwright with no husband and no son, and less for one who priced her work by what it was worth rather than by what a woman was supposed to charge. The shop sat at the south edge of a settlement called Ojo Frio, named for a cold spring that had gone half to mud, and the freight road ran past her door, carrying everything but custom to her hands. Her father had taught her 3 things, and he had repeated them so often that she heard them still in the dark of the shop after he was gone. "A wheel is honest," he said. "It will tell you exactly where it is weak if you only listen. A joint hides nothing from the man who cut it, and everything from the man who did not." And the last, which she had not understood as a child and understood now in her bones, was this: a wagon is built by hands, and hands leave a record, and a careful person can read a builder the way you read his handwriting. He had built false bottom seats and hidden grain bins and strongbox cradles for freighters all up and down the Alajan Road for 30 years, and he had taught her every trick of them because the men who paid for hiding places did not care who built them so long as the work held. So when word came down the road that a freight wagon lay wrecked and abandoned in the bottom of Calabash Draw, 8 miles out, and that the freight line had written it off and would let it go to anyone fool enough to fetch it, Lurleen thought first of the iron. Good wagon iron was worth money. The tires alone, if the wheels were not all broken, would pay for a month of flour. The skein bands, the bolstered plates, the king bolt, the brake hardware, all of it could be drawn out and reforged or sold to the smith. A wreck was not a wreck to her. It was. She did not yet know that it was also a grave marker, and that the man it marked had spent his last hour building something into it that he meant for someone to find. The freight agent's name was Sherman Dunmore, and he kept his office in a frame building beside the depot with his own name painted gold above the door. He had come into the country 6 years back as a clerk and risen to agent, and then to something larger than agent, a man who decided which claims along the water were live and which were abandoned, which teamsters were paid and which were forgotten, which papers were filed and which quietly were not. He was not a large man. He was a tidy one with clean cuffs and a careful hand, and the carefulness was the dangerous part. When Lurleen came to ask after the wrecked wagon in the draw, he looked at her over his ledger and smiled the smile of a man granting a small kindness. The wagon, he said, belonged to the line by default, the driver being dead, and the freight long since recovered. She was welcome to it. He doubted she could move it. He said this last without unkindness, the way a man states the weather, and he wrote her name in his book beside the word abandoned, and charged her $4 for the salvage rights, and wished her luck with it. $4. She counted the coins onto his desk, and he counted them back into his drawer, and neither of them knew yet what $4 had just bought. She walked the 8 miles to Calabash Draw the next morning with her mule, a stub-eared brown jenny named Biscuit, who had pulled for her father before her, and trusted no one else alive. The draw was a long, sandy cut between two low mesas, and the wagon lay at the bottom of it, where a flash flood had carried it 2 springs before and slammed it against a shelf of rock and left it there. Lurline stood at the lip of the draw and looked down at the wreck for a long time before she went to it. It'd been a heavy freight wagon, a big road wagon built for the long hauls, and the flood had not been gentle. The off-rear wheel was shattered to kindling, the bed had sprung at the seams, and silted half full of flood sand. One bow of the canvas frame still stood, bare as a rib. The brake beam was snapped, and the whole of it had weathered 2 years in the open, so that the red oxide paint had bleached to the color of dried blood and peeled in long curls, and rust ran down from every iron fitting in streaks like old tear. It was, by any reckoning anyone in Ocho Frio would make, worthless. She climbed down into the draw and began, as her father had taught her, to listen. She ran her hand along the felloes of the 3 sound wheels and found 2 of them true. She rocked the bolsters and read the king bolt by feel and found it whole. She knocked along the bed boards with the heel of her hand, listening for rot, and found the floor mostly sound under the silt. The iron was good. The salvage was real, better than she had hoped. She could draw $40 of hardware out of this wreck if she could get it home, and the timber that survived was seasoned oak and hickory worth more than green wood at any price. She had been right to come. She had been right, and the men at the depot had been wrong, and that small, private fact warmed her more than the morning sun. Then she came to the seat, and the seat was wrong. She knew wagons the way other people know faces. She had spent her life among them, and a freighter's driving seat was a thing she could have built, blindfolded, a plain box of pine with a hinged lid for the driver's small goods, a coil of rope, a tin of axle grease, a day's bread. This seat was heavier than it should be. She felt it the moment she set her hand on the lid and tried to lift it. The hinge was rusted, and she expected the weight of a rusted lid. But this was more than that. The box did not ring hollow when she rapped it. It rang the way a thing rings when it is built double, a box inside a box, with something between. Her father's voice came up out of memory then, plain as the rock under her boots. A careful person can read a builder, and she knew, standing in the bottom of that dry draw with the sun going hard overhead, that the man who built this seat had not built it the way a wagon man builds a seat. He had built it the way a wheelwright builds a hiding place. He had built it the way her father built them. She did not open it there. That was the first decision, and it was the one that mattered. She could have pried at the lid in the draw, with the desert empty around her and no eyes to see, and learned what it held inside the hour. She did not. The hinge was seized, and the wood was swollen with 2 springs of weather, and to force it in the field was to risk splitting the box and losing whatever the swelling had sealed. Her father had a word for men who forced a joint rather than freed it. He called them butchers. She would not butcher this. Whatever the dead man had hidden, he had hidden it carefully, and she would meet his care with her own. She would bring it home whole, and she would open it the way it deserved to be opened, on a bench, with the right tools and the right patience. So she made it fast to Biscuit and to her own shoulders, and she began the long haul up out of the draw. And that was the day the men came out to watch and to laugh. Let them laugh, she thought, and she pulled. The first day she made 3 miles. The wagon fought her at every rise, the locked wheel cutting a trench, the broken axle dragging, and twice she had to stop and lever it off a rock with a pole and a fulcrum stone, and the whole of her weight thrown against the end of the lever. She had brought what her father would have brought, and no more, because a load grows by every pound you add to fight it. She brought the long oak lever and 3 good fulcrum stones chosen for their shape. She brought a length of chain and a snatch block to double the mule's pull where the grade was worst, rigging it to a juniper stump or a half-buried boulder, and taking up the slack a hand's breadth at a time. She brought a bucket and a rasp, and the farrier's tools, and water for 2 days, and bread, nothing else, because the rest was weight. Biscuit pulled true and steady and asked nothing of her but that she pulled too, leaning into the collar with her ears flat and her haunches low, and when the wreck came unstuck and lurched forward, the mule did not startle but only gathered and pulled again. By dark they had come 3 miles, and Lurline slept beside the wreck in the open, with the mule picketed close. The cold coming down off the mesas, hard and quick, the way it does in that country. And in the morning, her shoulders had gone the color of the bruised paint, and her palms had split where the rope rode them, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her underskirt, and she pulled anyway. The second day she made 2 miles, and the road climbed, and a freighter she knew slightly came down it, with an empty wagon, and pulled up to watch her strain and offered, not unkindly, to haul the wreck the rest of the way for $1. She thanked him and said no. It was not the $1. It was that the seat was hers to bring home, and she would not have it ride the last miles on another man's bed, where another man's hands might rest on it and feel what she had felt. She did not say that. She said only that she would manage, and the freighter shook his head and drove on, and told the men at the depot that night that the wheelwright woman had gone simple over a pile of scrap. On the 3rd day Biscuit threw a shoe, the near hind, on a stony stretch where a lost shoe could lame a mule, and a lame mule could end the haul 8 miles from anywhere. Lurline set it herself by the roadside with the tools in her satchel, because a wheelwright is half a farrier, whether she wishes to be or not. She backed the jenny against the bank, lifted the foot into her lap, pared the broken edge of the hoof clean, and shaped the old shoe true again over a rock for an anvil, and drove the nails one at a time and clinched them down, talking low to the mule the whole while in the voice her father had used on frightened animals. And the mule stood for her, because the mule trusted her, and that trust had been earned across years and not given. The men at the depot did not hear about that, because there was no one on that stretch of road to see a woman do calmly the thing they would have called impossible. That was the shape of her whole life, she thought, kneeling in the dust with the mule's hoof in her apron. The hard things she did well were done where no one watched, and the doubt was spoken where everyone could hear. The days ran together after that into a single long pull. The 4th day, the off-front wheel, which she had judged sound, began to dish and complain under the dragging weight, and she stopped and trued it with a wedge and a wrapping of green rawhide that would shrink tight as it dried, of field repair, ugly and good, and it held. The 5th day the wind came up out of the southwest and drove grit into everything, into her eyes and the mule's, into the split skin of her hands, into her bread, and they made barely a mile into it. And she did not curse the wind, because cursing the wind was a waste of breath she needed for pulling. The 6th and 7th days were better, the grade easing toward the settlement, and she let herself begin to believe she would bring it in. Through all of it, the seat rode, where it had always ridden, heavier than a seat should be, and she did not pry at it, and the not prying was its own kind of labor, the patience harder some hours than the pulling. It took 11 days to bring the wreck the 8 miles home. 11 days, because she would not force the pace and break the mule or the wagon, because the road was bad and her body was one woman's body. She came into Ojo Frio at the head of it. On the 11th evening, with the sun behind her, and the wreck dragging its long furrow down the main street past Dunmore's office with his gold name on the door, and the men came out again to watch her, and this time they did not laugh quite so loud. Because 11 days of refusing to quit is a thing even a doubter learns to respect a little, though he will not say so. She put the wreck in the yard behind the shop, and she unhitched Biscuit and rubbed her down and fed her, because that came first and always had. Then she lit the lamp in the shop and looked at the seat box where it sat under the bench, and she did not open it that night either. She was too tired to do careful work, and careful work was the only kind the box deserved. She slept, and in the morning she began. What she did not yet know was that Sherman Dunmore had watched the wreck come down the street from his window, and had felt, for the first time in 6 years, a small, cold finger of unease he could not name. The freeing of the seat took 4 days, and Lurline gave it the 4 days the way her father had given his hardest work its time. The hinge first. She did not pry it. She soaked it in oil morning and night, working the oil into the seized pin with a feather and a needle, flexing it a degree at a time as the rust let go, until on the second morning the lid lifted on its own weight and showed her the shallow top tray of the seat, which held exactly what such a tray should hold: a coil of dry rotted rope, a tin of axle grease gone to stone, the broken stem of a clay pipe. The ordinary things. The things meant to be found by anyone who lifted the lid and looked no further. She lifted out the tray, and under it the box went solid, a flat false floor of pine fitted so close she could not have slid a knife blade into the seam. A man who lifted the lid, saw the rope and the grease, and reached no deeper, would have sworn the seat was only a seat. Lurline set her thumbs on the false floor and felt along its edges in the lamplight, reading it the way she read a wheel, and she found at the back left corner the thing she was looking for: a pin. A single hidden dowel, no thicker than a pencil, set flush and waxed, that pinned the false floor down. Her father had built 100 of them. You did not pry the floor. You drew the pin, and the floor came up like a hinged thing, and a man who pried it instead would split the wood and never know there had been a pin at all. She made a tool for it because the right tool did not exist, and so she made it a slender hooked pick filed down from a horseshoe nail, and on the 4th day she set the hook against the waxed head of the dowel and drew it, slow and even, the way you draw a splinter from a child's hand, and the pin came free into her palm, down 1.5 inches of oak worn smooth by the hand that set it. She held it a moment. Then she lifted the false floor of the seat, and the cold air of 9 years, sealed inside, came up to meet her face. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth gone dark with age, lay a flat tin document box, and beside it, folded small and tucked along the side, a man's letter. She did not snatch them up. She sat back on her heels on the shop floor, with the lamp throwing her shadow huge on the wall, and she let herself understand, for one long breath, that she was the first person to look into this box, since the man who closed it had drawn that pin and seeded that floor and driven away to die in a flood. Whatever this was, he had not hidden it from thieves. A thief takes iron and timber and never thinks to read a seat. He had hidden it from someone who would have known to look and known to destroy what he found. He had hidden it the careful way, the wheelwright's way, and then he had trusted the desert and the years to keep it until the right hands came. She lifted out the letter first and unfolded it under the lamp and read it twice. The man's name had been Reuben Cordero, and he had been a freighter on the Alazan road, and he had written the letter knowing he might not live to deliver what it guarded. It was not a long letter. It was a freighter's letter, plain and short and honest. He wrote that he carried in this seat the proof of a theft, and that the theft was the water. He wrote that the cold spring that gave Ojo Frio its name, and the run of good bottom land along the Alazan that the spring fed, had been claimed and proved up years before by a dozen small families, his own among them, under the laws that let a settler earn his land by living on it and working it. He wrote that the freight line's agent had wanted that water for the line's own stock and its own depot and its own profit, and that the agent had not bought the claims or fought them in the open. He had made them disappear on paper. He had filed papers declaring the claims abandoned, with dates and signatures that were lies, and where the true filings had gone into the Territorial Land Office, his false ones had come out, and the families had been told their claims were void and their deposits forfeit and their years of work worth nothing. Reuben Cordero had been a freighter, not a lawyer, but he had hauled for the land office, and he had learned where the true papers were kept, and one night he had taken back the things that proved the truth. The original claim filings, stamped and dated by the territorial clerk, true on their face. The survey plat, showing the spring and the bottomland, and every family's parcel marked plain. And a ledger leaf, torn from the agent's own book, where the agent had written in his own careful hand the deposits he had taken and never returned, the wages of teamsters he had pocketed, the small thefts that added up over 6 years to a stolen valley. Cordero wrote that he meant to carry these to the federal court at the territorial capital, where the freight agent's hand did not reach. He wrote that if the seat was opened by a stranger, he asked that stranger, in the name of God and of plain dealing, to carry the box to a lawyer or a judge and not to the freight line, and to see that his wife and the families got back what was theirs. He signed it, and under his name he wrote the date, and the date was 9 years gone. Lurleen sat with the letter a long time. She was 31 years old, and she had been measured all her life by people who had never looked closely at her, and here in her hands was the same thing done to a dozen families and to a dead man, measured by a tidy clerk who had never looked closely at anyone he ruined. She understood it the way you understand a thing that has been waiting for you. The man had not died for nothing. He had built his proof into the one thing he trusted, the work of hands, and the flood had taken him before he could carry it, and the freight line had written off the wreck as worthless, and let it lie 9 years in a draw, because they could not imagine that a wrecked wagon. And then a wheelwright's daughter had paid $4 for the iron. She opened the tin box and read the papers by lamplight until the lamp guttered, and everything the letter promised was there. The stamped filings, the survey plat with the parcels marked, the torn ledger leaf in the agent's own careful hand. She knew that hand. She had watched it write her name beside the word abandoned and count $4 into a drawer. The careful hand was Sherman Dunmore's, and the date on the ledger leaf was older than his agency, which meant he had been doing this since before they called him agent, which meant the carefulness had been there from the start. She closed the box and she did not go to the law in the morning, because the law in Ojo Frio was the agent's friend, and the deputy drank on the agent's tab, and a wheelwright woman walking into the depot with a tin box of stolen freight line papers would not walk out with them. She thought instead the way her father had taught her to think about a heavy load. You do not lift it all at once. You find a point where it will move, and you move it from there. The point where it would move was a woman named Tomasa Cordero, the freighter's widow, who still lived 4 miles up the Alajan, on a dry parcel of the bottomland that had once been theirs, scratching corn out of ground the freight line let her keep because it had no water left in it worth taking. Lurline knew her by sight, an old woman in black who came into Ojo Frio twice a year to sell eggs. She did not know that the woman had spent 9 years certain her husband had run off, because that was the story the freight line had let stand, easier than the truth, that Ruben Cordero had been a freighter who took the line's road and the line's pay. Lurline drove out to her with biscuit and the cart on a still gray morning, the tin box wrapped in her father's leather apron under the seat. She did not announce what she carried. She sat in the swept dirt yard of the old woman's jackal, and she told her plainly and without softening it that her husband had not run, that he had died in the flood at Calabash Draw 9 years before, that the wagon had lain there ever since, and that in the seat of it he had built and hidden the proof of why he died. Then she put the letter in the old woman's hands and let her read her husband's own writing in her own time. Tomasa Cordero did not weep loudly. She read the letter through, and her hands shook, and when she came to the place where her husband asked a stranger to see that his wife got back what was theirs, she pressed the paper flat against her chest and was quiet a long time. When she spoke at last, her voice was steady and old and clear. "He did not run," she said. It was the only thing she said for a while, and she said it twice, the way a person says the thing they have needed for 9 years to be true. That was the alliance, and it was not made of speeches. It was made of a letter, and an old woman's hands, and a wheelwright who had brought a dead man home without knowing it. From that morning, the thing was no longer Lurline's alone, and that mattered, because a wronged widow, with her husband's own letter, was a thing the careful agent could not so easily make disappear. They did not go to the deputy, and they did not go to Dunmore. They went, the two of them, to a circuit lawyer named Wendell Pratt, who rode through Ojo Frio twice a year, and who had no debt to the freight line and no love for it either, a thin, patient man who had watched the line eat the small claims along the water for years and had been able to do nothing without proof. Lurline laid the tin box open on his table in the lamplight of the boarding house, the stamped filings, the plat, the ledger leaf, and she watched him read them the way she had watched her father read a joint, slow and careful, missing nothing, and she watched his face change. He read for a long time and said nothing, turning each sheet to the lamp and back, holding the stamped filings up so the light came through, the territorial clerk's seal pressed into the paper. He took out his own spectacles and set them on his nose and bent close over the ledger leaf in the agent's careful hand. And once he made a small sound in his throat, the sound a man makes when a thing he has long suspected turns solid in front of him. He laid the forged abandonment paper down beside the true filing so the two dates sat side by side under the lamp where any man could compare them. "These are true filings," he said at last very quietly, "stamped by the territorial clerk. And these abandonment papers, the line filed against them, are forgeries on their face, because a claim filed in this office on this date cannot also be abandoned on a date before it was filed." He set his finger on the one date, then the other. He had written the lie too fast. He had not thought the true papers would ever surface to lie beside his own. "A careful man," said Wendell Pratt, and his voice held no admiration in it. "Careful in everything but his hurry. The hurry is here in the ink, and the hurry will hang him." Then Wendell Pratt looked up at the two women, the wheelwright and the widow, and he asked the only question that mattered. He asked whether they understood what it would mean to carry this to the federal court at the Capitol, that the line would fight it, that the agent would call them thieves for holding stolen freight line property, that it would be long and it would be hard, and it might cost them everything they had before it was through. Lurline thought of 11 days of dragging a wreck up out of a draw. and she said that she understood about long and hard. Tomasa Cordero said only that her husband had asked, and that was answer enough. The agent did not sit still while they prepared. That was the part Lurline had braced for, because her father had taught her that a man, careful enough to forge a paper, is careful enough to guard the forgery, and Dunmore was nothing if not careful. Word of the wreck and the seat had reached him, as such things do in a settlement, and he understood at once what 9 years had buried and what $4 had bought, and he moved to protect what he had built. He sent his deputy friend to the shop with a paper of his own, an affidavit that the salvage rights had been sold for the iron and timber only, and that any documents found in the wagon remained property of the freight line, and a demand that Lurline Seren. She had expected it, and she had prepared for it, and this was where the wheelwright's daughter proved she had listened to her father about more than wood. She had not kept the papers in the shop. The morning after she read them, she had made true copies of every sheet in her own careful hand. The filings, the plat, the ledger leaf, every date and stamp and number set down exact, and she had carried the originals to Wendell Pratt and left the copies wrapped in oilcloth in the seat box where the deputy now came to look. So when the deputy turned out the shop and found the wreck and pried up the seat and carried off the oilcloth bundle in triumph, he carried off copies, and the agent burned them in his stove that night, believing he had burned the only proof in the world, and slept easy for the first time since the wreck came down the street, and was wrong. The originals went to the Capitol in Wendell Pratt's saddlebag, with the 2 women riding beside him, 4 days on the road, and Lurline brought Biscuit, because she would not leave the mule and because the mule had pulled the proof out of the draw and had earned the road. The federal court did not move quickly. Nothing about it was the swift, clean victory the men at the depot would have understood. It moved the way her father's joints moved, slow and sure and certain, a degree at a time as the rust let go. The line's lawyers called the women thieves, and called the papers stolen, and called the whole thing the grievance of a deserted wife and a failed tradeswoman. And then Wendell Pratt laid the stamped filings beside the forged abandonments on the judge's bench, and a careful man read them the way careful men do, and the dates that could not both be true did the work that no speech could do. It took the better part of a year. Lurline went home, and trued wheels and set tires, and brought Biscuit through a hard winter, and twice more she rode to the Capitol when the court called her to testify to how she had found the seat, and freed the pen, and read the builder, and she told it plainly each time, the way a wheelwright tells a thing. And a federal judge who had perhaps never thought about how a false bottom seat is built came to understand that the proof had been hidden by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and meant exactly for it to be found. In the end, the forged papers were set aside as the lies they were. The claims along the Alazan were restored to the families who had proved them up. Tomasa Cordero's among them, the bottomland and the share of the cold spring that fed it. The deposits and the forfeited years could not all be given back, but the water could. And on the frontier, the water was the life of everything. And a valley that had been stolen on paper came back on paper to the people who had earned it with their hands. Sherman Dunmore was not hanged, and was not shot, and did not die in any reckoning a balladeer would sing. He was simply finished. The federal finding cost him his agency and his standing. The gold name came down off the door, and the careful man who had ruled which claims were live and which were dead was himself struck off as a forger. And he left the country quietly the way such men do, and the settlement that had taken his word for 6 years did not follow him to say goodbye. Lurline never saw him again, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that she did not need to. She did not gloat, and there was no scene in the street where the men who had laughed were made to eat their words. That was not how it went, and she would not have wanted it to. What happened instead was smaller and truer. The freighter who had offered to haul her wreck for $1 came to the shop one day with real work, a tired axle and an honest price, and he did not say he had been wrong about her. But he brought his custom, and his custom said it for him. The men at the depot stopped telling the story of the simple woman who hauled home scrap, because the story had a different ending now, and they did not come off well in it. And slowly, the way trust comes on the frontier, which is to say through work done right and not through words, the wheelwright shop at the south edge of Ojo Frio became simply the place you took a wheel that mattered, and the question of whether a woman could true it quietly stopped being asked. Tomasa Cordero got her husband back in the only way that was left. The court finding said in plain federal language that Ruben Cordero had not abandoned his claim and had not deserted his wife, that he had died in the flood at Calabash Draw, carrying proof of a wrong done to his neighbors. And the old woman, who had borne 9 years of the other story, carried the true one home and was at the last a widow instead of a woman whose man had run, which is a different and a better thing to be. She came down to Ojo Frio more often after that, and she and Lurline took to drinking coffee together in the door of the shop when the road was quiet, two solitary women who had moved, a heavy thing between them, and that was the nearest thing to family either of them had, and it was enough. The wreck itself, Lurline never broke up for salvage. She had paid $4 for the iron, and the iron was good, and she had needed the money, and she drew none of it. She mended the wagon instead. It took her the better part of 2 winters, working it in the slow hours between paying jobs, and she did it the way her father would have done it, freeing every seized joint rather than forcing it, replacing the shattered wheel with one she built true to match the survivors, drawing the bleached paint down to clean wood and laying on fresh red oxide, so the long furrows of rust were gone, and the wagon stood square and sound in her yard, as it had stood the day Ruben Cordero drove it new. She left the seat exactly as it was. She did not fill the hidden space, and she did not seal the pin. She kept the slender hooked pick she had filed from a horseshoe nail in the tray with the rope and the grease, and now and then when someone came to the shop who needed to understand how a builder leaves a record that outlasts him, she would draw the pin and lift the false floor, and let them feel the cold air of the empty space, and understand that the work of careful hands can carry a truth across years, and across a death, and across every doubt of every man who never looked closely. Her father had told her that a joint hides nothing from the man who cut it. She understood by the end that he had been telling her something larger than woodwork. The world had cut a great many joints badly, and trusted that no one would ever read them, and the only defense the small and the dismissed had ever had was a pair of patient hands and the willingness to look closely at the thing everyone else threw away. If you ever been the one they did not look at twice, the one they laughed at for keeping the broken thing, you already know how this woman felt the morning the floor came up. If a moment of that landed, sit with it and carry the story of someone the world undervalued to whoever needs to hear it tonight. The last of it is a small thing, the kind her father would have ended on. On a clear morning this spring after the court was done, Lurline hitched Biscuit to the mended wagon and drove it 4 miles up the Alizon to Tomasa Cordero's parcel, where the water ran again in the ditch the line had let go dry. And she drove it slow down the bottomland in the new light, so the old woman could see her husband's wagon whole and red and square as the day he built his secret into it. The seat rode where it had always ridden, the rope coiled in the tray, the floor pinned down over the empty space that had held the truth for 9 years and had given it up at last. The 2 women sat on that seat together a while in the sun, with the corn coming green around them and the cold spring running clear, and neither of them said very much, because the wagon and the water said all of it. And a thing, said by hands, does not need to be said again with words.